Hey, are you interested in getting into wildlife photography? If you are and you're kind of stuck as to what gear you really need to get started, or you don't know what to do to get started, this is going to be the video for you. Let's get into it. All right, let's talk about the essential gear, the what you have to have in order to start wildlife photography. Now, to preface, if this is a genre that you've never explored before and you've just kind of seen some YouTube videos of some wildlife photographers out there, I will say this genre of photography does take a lot of patience to do. And the reason being is you can't script nature. You could possibly go out and be out there for hours and not even get a single image. This is a very patient oriented genre of photography. So, with that said, if you don't currently own any gear, I would suggest that you borrow or rent before you get into wildlife photography, because in the front end, you end up purchasing the gear, you go out, you try it, and you find out it's not for you. You've just spent a lot of money on that gear. So, with that said, camera. Let's talk about the camera. You really don't need the most expensive camera out there to capture wildlife photography, especially if you're just starting out. If eventually you're going to get into this genre of photography professionally, where you're going to earn money from it, then you should consider upgrading to those specific cameras, which we'll talk about here in a second. But to get started, what you need, just even an entry-level DSLR mirrorless, will get you started on what you need to do. If you go to this video here that I'm going to link after you finish watching this, that video will help you set up your camera so that you have a better chance of capturing that wildlife image. And with those settings, you really have a better chance. You don't have to have, I'm a Sony shooter, for instance, so the Sony A1 or Sony A9, which are cameras dedicated, they have very high shutter speeds, their autofocus system is impeccable. They have options to capture the eye when it's focusing of the animal, or recognizes the animal, and therefore the autofocus snaps onto it very quickly. Nikon has, I believe it's the Z7 is their kind of sports action wildlife camera. And then Canon has, I believe, the R6. Don't quote me on that. I'll put it in the link below. So if you're a Canon shooter, or Nikon, so on and so forth. Olympus, their mirrorless cameras are excellent as well. But you don't have to have the most expensive camera to start out. I currently shoot with a Sony a7R III. That camera is now, I believe, 5 to 7 years old, and I capture wildlife images just fine with those settings that I share with you. Later on, if you decide that this is the genre you want to go to and you want to do it professionally where you make money off of it, those higher end cameras are better for the reasons of they are newer, their processing power is quicker, it's better, they have better low light performance, and the autofocus is really where it's at to help you capture those images. So to start out, an entry level is just fine. If you're going to do it professionally, then those higher end cameras are going to do you better service than those entry level cameras. So look at my notes here. Yeah, so those higher end cameras are more dedicated to sports and action. They'll capture, like I said, with the incredibly fast shutter speeds of 30 frames per second on up. So those will be more dedicated to it. But like I said, that is just for professional application, because those cameras are expensive. They're upwards of $5,000, $6,000 for those cameras. All right, let's talk about lenses. So lenses are pretty important in that you have to have a telephoto lens. Now, the reason being is the further away you are from the animals, the better chance you have of capturing the image. The closer you get, the animals get skittish and then they will run away. So that's point number one. Point number two is the further you have of reach, the bigger your subject will be in the frame. So for instance, a 600 millimeter lens will have a bigger subject in the frame, and then in post-production, in Lightroom or whatever editing suite you have, you won't have to crop in so much, which if you haven't done before, the more you crop into an image, the worse that image looks. And the reason being is because you're taking out all that resolution, all that image quality, for a lack of a better term, will pretty much go out the window. So the longer the reach, the bigger your subject will be in the frame, so you won't have to crop in, and then better chances you have of taking a picture of that animal because you're not intruding into its space and therefore running off. So what do we need? A minimum of 300 millimeters will serve you to capture some wildlife. And this isn't going to be where, I don't know, Yellowstone National Park or maybe your local state park. It's not really going to do you that well in those instances, but maybe like a city park or somewhere where the wild animals are more tame, and not necessarily tame, but more used to people being around. So ducks or squirrels or animals of city living if you're within the city, or maybe a local pond or something if you're out more in rural communities. So 300 millimeters is going to be about the shortest that you should have as far as telephoto. 600 millimeters, 400 millimeters will be a good area, but they also make teleconverters. Now, there is an upside and a downside to the teleconverter. So let's talk about the pros. The teleconverter will help give you that extra reach of either 1.4 or 2 times magnification. Now, with that, it will make your subject even bigger in the frame because it's giving you that extra reach. Now, the cons of using teleconverters is that it's an extra piece of glass between your sensor, your camera, and your lens. Now, by engineering and because of the limitation of the glass, even if you have the best glass that money can buy in these lenses, putting more glass in front of glass basically deteriorates your image. So it's not going to be as sharp. You may get some artifacting as far as chromatic aberration and some of those artifacts. Now, teleconverters have gotten better over the years. However, you're still having to put glass in front of glass, which when light traverses through, a lot of things can happen. Therefore, your image gets softer and it's not as sharp. But with the programs that we have now between Lightroom, Photoshop, Another company I use, Topaz, they have sharpen. You can improve your image back to how it was before that extra piece of glass was on. So the teleconverters at 1.4 and 2 time zoom will help get that subject bigger in the frame. All right, so that part is done. Let's talk about cost-wise and how lenses from your cheaper to your more expensive will, how the quality and performance. So this here is a Sony 200 to 600 f/5.6 to 6.3. What that means, it's a variable aperture lens. So at 200 millimeters, I can shoot an image at 5.6. But as I start to zoom in, right at about 300 millimeters, it will close down to 6.3. Now, what that means is when the iris closes down, my image is going to be darker because it's letting less light in. So there is a limitation with this lens, and especially because I have an older camera, that Sony a7R III, I believe is somewhere between 5 and 7 years old now. When I have to crank up that ISO, it introduces a lot of noise in the image, which I then have to go into post-production, whether I use Lightroom denoise or Topaz denoise, depending on the severity of the noise. I can bring that noise level down and still get a usable image. Now, when it comes to taking photos at like blue hour where there's almost no light, I cannot do it because I have to crank the ISO up so high that I don't get usable images. And it doesn't matter whether I put it in through Topaz or Lightroom. The programs, they work, but they're not miracle workers, right? So that is the difference between, so this here is a $2,000 lens. When you go into the professional lines, we're talking the 400 f4, the 600 f5.6, and I believe one of the manufacturers now, I don't know if it's Canon or Nikon, have a 400 2.8, which is just absolutely ridiculous. That it's awesome, but it is pricey. So I don't know exactly the price of that one, but a 400 f4 will cost you between $12,000 and $13,000, and then the 600 5.6 will cost you between $14,000 and $15,000, I believe. So very expensive lenses. However, they are great in low light because pairing it with one of the higher end cameras that have great low light performance and great autofocus, you'll be able to get those shots when the animals are most active in the early evening or early morning and kind of that late evening where the sun is coming down and you have low light. So that is the difference in price point, and that is the difference in performance. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been using this lens here now for the better part of a year, and I've been able to get some incredible images with this lens and my a7R III. Learning the limitations and learning to work with those limitations is what gets you those images. It's not necessarily the equipment. And I have a video, and I can link it up here to show you that it doesn't matter, for the most part, what gear you use. It's the skill in the photographer, okay? But enough about that. All right, moving on. So starting out, you're just gonna have a camera and a lens, maybe a 70 to 300 or something to that effect. Your system isn't gonna get very heavy. So you might be able to get away with walking around and kind of just holding your system up and taking shots as you go. Two things are wrong with that. So let's start with moving around. When it comes to nature and specifically wildlife photography, the more you move around, the more noise you're going to make. So the more noise you make, the less animals are going to be around that noise, because for them, it signals danger. Therefore, they're not going to be around. Secondly, once you move on to heavier systems, you're going to end up getting fatigued quicker and run a high risk of not being able to get a shot, because you've been holding that monster up and now your arms are tired, you can't get that up, the lens, and you miss your shot. So what do? I use a tripod. I go and I walk out to a specific location. I set up, I put my equipment, my gear on a tripod, and then I wait. This is where that patience in the genre of wildlife photography comes in. You have to be able to sit in one place and just be still and let the wildlife come to you. You actually have a better chance, a higher chance of capturing wildlife images that way than walking around making a whole bunch of noise. Now, if you're in like a state park or a city park or somewhere where the animals are more used to human interaction, that's not going to be an issue. But if you go out to less traveled areas by humans, those animals are going to be very skittish and you won't see them. So you have a better chance sitting still. So what do? Tripod is the next piece of equipment that I highly suggest that you get. Now, with that said, you have to have a good quality, sturdy tripod. Now, a backstory. I've been photographing now for roughly 15 years. In those 15 years, I've purchased 7 tripods, but 6 of them before I purchased my good one at roughly $120 to $150 a pop. Now, you take that times 6, and that's actually more expensive than the tripod that I finally got, my 7th tripod, that has now lasted me for 3 years. So, it can't be understated to get a good tripod that will last you, because in the long run, you'll spend less money. Now, the tripod that I have is from Robus, and I'll leave a link in the description to the one I use. They also have a lighter one, but it is a very robust tripod. It is very sturdy. It is good quality. This one in particular is carbon fiber, so it is very strong. It does not come with a head, so you have to buy that separately. However, we're going to talk about that in just a second, because there's a specific head that you really need to use that will up your game in actually being able to capture the wildlife. So back to the tripod. I bought this tripod about 3 years ago when I was at WPPI in Vegas, and I just happened to be going by and saw the vendor because I was in the market for a tripod, because the one I was using at the time, the ball head was, it wouldn't lock in place. So I could set my camera up there and I'd tighten it down and it was loose and my camera would tilt. So at that point, I had realized how many tripods I've purchased and what that meant financially. So I saw this vendor, and this particular tripod at the time was $500. But at $500, it's still cheaper than the 6 tripods that I had to buy prior to that. So, as I said before, it's lasted me 3 years. It's a very good, sturdy tripod. It's strong. I haven't had any issues with it in the 3 years I've had it. So, next on top to use, I highly recommend a gimbal head versus a ball head. Now, the reason being, the ball head when you loosen it and you are panning or tracking your subject, because it's a ball, when you turn, it's not going to turn on an even axis. Because it's a ball, it's going to start dipping, and because you're more focused on the subject and trying to make sure it's in the frame and that you're capturing it, you're not going to notice that you are not level as you're panning with the subject. Now, what that ends up being is at the end, you're going to end up having some wonky images because your horizons aren't level, you're dipped down, you're almost at a what they call a Dutch angle, that is used more to introduce a kind of like anxious feeling into your image. But that is not what you want. So, secondly, using a ball head, when you're not actually at your camera using it, you have to lock it down. Otherwise, your camera and gear and everything is going to go over, and then that's a very expensive mistake to make. With the gimbal head is set on the tripod and it only goes up, down, left, and right. There's no in between. It gives you smooth tracking of your subject and it keeps you level. 1. 2, with the gimbal head, once you get your system on there and balanced correctly, you don't have to lock it down. It doesn't matter what position you leave your camera or your system in. If you put it in a certain position, you let go of the system. If it's balanced, it's going to stay right in place and it's not going to go anywhere. Now, why is that important? When you're out there, milliseconds actually count in making sure that you capture a wildlife image, right? It's not scripted. You don't know how long you have before the animal ends up leaving. So having a ball head and everything locked down means you have to get to your camera, you have to unlock all your setting or your ball head, you have to unlock it and then get to your camera and set and take a picture. Well, by that time, it's a possibility that your animal is gone. Whereas with a gimbal head, it's already unlocked, it's ready to go. All you have to do is get to your camera, set up, frame, and start snapping away. And it's more secure, it's more stable, and you don't have to worry about it. So that is why I recommend having a gimbal head versus a ball head. So I'll leave a link to the gimbal head that I purchased off of Amazon. I don't know if they're available anymore, but there are others that are right around the same price point. Because that's another thing. Gimbals, just like tripods, the gimbal heads go up into the $1,000, $1,500 range, maybe even more expensive, depending on what brand you buy. Now, just like anything else, the higher the price point, the better the performance. In this case, I used a friend's gimbal head prior to getting my own, and his was definitely more expensive than mine. And I could tell in the tracking how much smoother it was to use, and it had a few other features that my gimbal didn't have. But at the price point, I believe it was, I think it was like $60 that gimbal head cost. It got the job done. It was still smooth enough. It panned, it tilted, it did what it needed to do. I balanced my camera on there correctly so I could just leave it and didn't have to lock it down. It got the job done. So that's what I mean about being able to use gear that is not expensive and still be able to do what you need to do, right? So tripod, gimbal head, stay in one particular area, let the wildlife come to you. Okay, the last piece of essential kit that you'll need is a pair of binos. So why a pair of binos? So if you're trying to use your camera to search for wildlife. One, you're going to have a narrow field of view. And by doing that, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on around you. So you could be at, we'll say 15 degrees, trying to look for an animal, and 5 degrees to your left, you can't see, but there's a wolf or an elk or something out there that you could have captured, but you didn't because you had that narrow field of view. Secondly, you have one eye that is constantly doing the searching. With that, your eye is going to get fatigued and you're going to end up missing a shot because you have to pull away from your camera, reset, make sure you relax your eye, and all that takes time. So with a set of binos, you have both eyes, you're using both eyes. So just like every day, your eyes won't get fatigued as quickly. Secondly, binos have a wider field of view, so you capture more of what's in front of you. Not to mention, you're not, and it's not in a negative way, but you're not at the tripod and kind of limited in the motion because you can look up, down, and in different directions quicker. Now, with that said, I haven't had any problems when I spot an animal with my binos and getting right to my camera, pointing in the direction, and then start snapping away. But binos will help tremendously in acquiring the animal quicker and not getting as fatigued with your eyes. So, a lot of stuff we've covered there. I hope this helps. I would greatly appreciate if you have found value in these videos. If you would like, subscribe, comment down below, let me know what you think. Any other piece of equipment that you think is vital or essential to starting out. One thing is I've noticed in my analytics that 91% of you out there viewing these videos are actually not subscribed. I would greatly appreciate if you would hit that subscribe button. One, so you don't miss any future videos that come out. And two, it would greatly help out the channel reach more people out there that are interested in photography, whether it's learning the basics or as in here where we're doing everything nature and wildlife related. So with that, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.